And now I'm joined by up-and-coming star within the Liberal Party, some say future Prime Minister. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Welcome to the Friday show, Senator Paterson. How are you?
I'm good, and with an introduction like that, Rita, I will come on every week. Very kind.
I'm going to beetle you up, but, once you've been built up, you've got to live up to it.
Well, now I'm only going to disappoint your viewers, but I'll do my best.
And we're going to have Nick Cater joining us very shortly. Again, he's been obviously a victim of the Melbourne traffic. It happens. It is
Shocking.
Mayhem in Melbourne at the moment. There is just roadworks that you perhaps think haven't been thought through properly, because they seem to be all happening at once in the same area.
This afternoon, Rita, it took me 40 minutes to get from East Melbourne to South Melbourne, so that shows how
so you could literally walk quicker, probably.
Much quicker. It would have taken me half the time.
Half the time to walk.
Yeah,
it's
crazy.
incredible. Now, I want to talk to you about a story probably you haven't been asked about. We touched on it in the last hour. The craziest story you'll ever hear. It's from the UK, and it involves a transgender prisoner who has been jailed for life after admitting to sexually assaulting two female inmates. Now, what makes this story astonishing is the fact that Karen White is a predator who had convictions for child sex offences, was accused of raping women, and then decided to identify as a woman. And despite the fact that he had a penis, he was sent to a women's prison. And he then assaulted multiple women, has now been sentenced to life, which in the UK means 9 years, so it's not really life. But that just to me seems an astonishing way of going about things, because where is the protection for that prison population where you put a predator behind bars with them?
Well, clearly, Rita, it's a massive failure of the system. And I know some transgender people, and they have not had easy lives. Imagine growing up feeling like your identity wasn't your own. That is not an easy thing. And those people, I think, they deserve our compassion and our support. One of the unfortunate things, though, is because this issue has become so politicised when really it should just be a medical issue, is that there are opportunities for people to take advantage of it. And clearly that seems to what's happened here. Someone has taken advantage of the political advantage that's come from this and thinking that he would get more favourable treatment if he said that he was a woman and has gone on to commit further horrific crimes. We can't allow our compassion for people that we should have to be taken advantage of by people who want to take advantage of our goodwill.
Well, that's pretty much what the Justice said, that this person was a predator who was a danger to women and children. And the prosecutor made the point that you just made, that they've essentially gamed the system. There's some doubts about whether their transgender identity is genuine and whether it's something they're just doing to put them in contact with vulnerable people who they can go on to abuse. So that in itself is a worry. And I wonder what the laws are in Australia. It would be state by state, but a similar thing could happen here, because if someone is going through the process of gender reassignment, they may be sent to a prison that is not the sex they were born, and that's going to could already be happening. It's something that we don't know yet.
Yeah, look, I certainly haven't heard of any similar cases, thank God, in Australia. But I think that point is right, Rita. We have to get the balance right between treating people decently and humanely and understanding the difficult position that they might be in because of their gender identity, and at the same time guarding against, sadly, the people out there who are a bit sick and who do seek to take advantage of these things and through no medical reason at all might seek to take advantage of our compassion or even our naivety. We shouldn't allow that to happen.
No, absolutely. Let's hope this case does serve as a warning and we don't go down the same road. Now to another story from the UK, and a minor online scandal with a UK retailer, Marks and Spencer, marketing hijabs for girls as young as 3. This has caused quite a bit of an outrage with the ex-Muslim community and moderate Muslims who've said that this is facilitating medievalism, I can't say that word, facilitating oppression of women is a good way of putting it, and also promoting gender apartheid. What do you think about this? Because modesty culture is you can make the argument, and I often do, that it's anti-women. But even in Saudi Arabia, girls age of 3 aren't required to cover their hair. So why would a major UK retailer be making these products to preserve the modesty of a 3-year-old?
Yeah, well, Rita, on the one hand, I'm a strong supporter of religious freedom, and that does mean being able to raise your children in your faith tradition and pass your values on to them. But if there's no genuine religious need for this, I really struggle to understand why it's been made available and why Marks and Spencer is getting into this.
Veiling isn't really a religious so much as a cultural.
Sure,
I mean,
yeah.
it's very tied in and intrinsically linked, but it's very much a cultural thing as opposed to a strict religious requirement.
And we're talking about 3-year-olds here. I think the Prime Minister, speaking about a totally separate issue, recently put it well when he said we should just let kids be kids.
Yeah.
Is it really necessary to veil a 3-year-old? I mean,
well, that's what I want to ask you about. With the religious freedoms debate this week has been roaring, and some of it's been sensible, some of it has been rather hysterical. There's been a lot of misinformation, and there are people genuinely concerned that if their child goes to a independent school, a Catholic school, an Islamic school, and they are gay, they're going to be discriminated against and perhaps even chucked out of the school. Is that something that can happen in Australia today?
Well, Rita, I've been involved in the religious freedom debate quite actively for some time, and in all my time and talking to people about what they would like to see protected, I have never, ever once had someone say to me, what we need to be protected is the right of a school to kick a gay kid out of class or out of school. No one's asked for that.
No.
This is not a first, second or even third order issue. There are much more substantive issues that are involved in the religious freedom debate. And it's since emerged that Fairfax didn't get the story right this week in their initial reporting. And now that the full Ruddock review has been put online by Fairfax, it's very clear that what the Ruddock review actually proposed was narrowing the existing exemptions for schools in this area. So currently, in many states, schools do have that right. I'm not aware actually of it being exercised, and a lot of schools have come out and said they wouldn't seek to do
Ruddock
this.
review, would those rights actually be curtailed?
Well, they will be narrowed. What they're proposing is that...
Would they still have an avenue to discriminate against a gay child and exclude them from the school population?
Well, it's important to consider this, that this is a review that's making recommendations to government. It does not represent the government's view, and the government will respond in due course. And the unfortunate thing about this report being leaked prematurely before the government's had the chance to prepare its response is that people are engaging in wild speculation about what the government might do, not what the government's actually going to do. So I would urge caution. I understand why people are sensitive about this. I completely understand that. But let's not jump at horses here when the government hasn't even responded to this report.
But I just think it needed to be clarified much quicker, because the debate just roared on, and this disinformation was spread, and people who care passionately about this issue were perhaps led astray and genuinely distressed needlessly. Like, why wasn't this clarified straight away when the Fairfax report came out? And if what you're saying, and the Prime Minister said it last night, it was manifestly wrong, then why wasn't the clarification given immediately?
Well, I think because the government wasn't prepared for this to be released in the way that it was, in the time that it was, and our response had not yet been finalised. And sometimes governments do get caught on the hop by leaks like this. But I can assure anyone out there listening that no one in the government wants to make it easier for a gay kid to be excluded from a religious school. It's just not on the agenda. No one wants to do that.
No. And let's bring in the other member of our panel, Nick Cater. Nick, how are you?
Well, thanks, Rita. Very well.
Fantastic. And what do you think about the government's handling of this issue throughout the week? Because it did seem to get away from them before they came back and clarified the report and their position.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I'm not privy to some of the information that James is privy to, but it seems to me they were clearly unprepared. They didn't have a strategy for handling because they didn't expect the report to come out. I mean, my understanding, I haven't read the report. I've spoken to a few people who have an understanding of what's in it, and my understanding is that it's very broad in the options it canvasses, different options, and I think that's one of the problems with the report. It doesn't really have a clear way, to guard against religious discrimination, and I understand that fully, because I think with our system, we have a common law system here. We don't have a Bill of Rights. It is very hard to pass, to put this into law, as we know with the Human Rights Commission and the Racial Discrimination Act. You might go in with the very best of intentions, but you end up creating something which has completely the opposite consequences. So I sort of sympathise with everybody, with the government, with Philip Ruddock, with every side of the debate. I think it's an enormous challenge to put this into law in a way that it's not going to be misused at some point.
And what do you think about the continual leaks? Because it has been so damaging for the Morrison government that any time they have a policy success, whether it's the tax cuts or any new measure, these leaks dominate the media reporting. And this was another leak.
Well, I don't agree. It's not helpful for a party or a government to have links, but I honestly think the Morrison government, or Scott Morrison as Prime Minister, has been performing exceptionally well. And when a Prime Minister seems to have momentum going with him, and you see the opposition, adjusting their strategy on the run so that they can keep up with him, then I think the ordinary public doesn't take too much notice of these. I mean, you do, and I guess I do too. We're in the zone, if you like. It's our job to follow this stuff. But I'd be very surprised. I don't know if James has been on the door knocking voters, but I'd be very surprised if anybody brought this up, to be honest.
Well, it's the sort of story that gets saturation coverage in certain segments of the media. And the ABC is one, and they're not small. They're a big operator. They're on every platform, and it just feeds that narrative that the coalition is not LGBT friendly, and that's going to be damaging going into Wentworth by-election.
Yes, but same-sex marriage became law on our watch through a process that we put in place. We've got more gay parliamentarians in the coalition than any other party has. We're very LGBTI friendly, but we also value very highly religious freedom. And I know there's been some criticism in the media and from others that the report, the Radical Review, wasn't released more earlier than it was. Well, what happened this week shows exactly why it wasn't. This is, as Nick says, it's a really complex area. It's important to get right. Prematurely releasing it would have caused this just earlier, and that's why the government's been carefully considering it. And Christian Porter, as Attorney General, in particular, has been carefully considering it so that we get the balance right. Now,
let's move on to hate crime hoax. There are one of these a week. I seem to be talking about these a lot, and you've got to wonder if our Western culture is so full of hate, then why are these activists forced to fake these crimes? This latest one comes from Ohio, where a journalism student and LGBT activist claims she received death threats only for police to discover she sent the threats to herself. Now, Anna Ayres has been charged with making 3 false reports to police, and it's a first-degree misdemeanour, and she could be jailed for 6 months for each charge. James, these things, I always sort of chuckle when I see them, but then I wonder what would motivate somebody to do that? Because it's always some sort of activist who seems to be behind a hoax, and often the hoax gets a lot of media coverage, and then when the hoax is found out to be a hoax, that doesn't get as much coverage. Well, the damage is done.
That's true, Rita, and I also think this is a bit of a case of a boy who cried wolf. People's compassion for genuine and real instances of hate crime, which thankfully are pretty rare, are going to be really tested, and people are going to be more sceptical when they hear about these stories in the future because they know sometimes there have been hoaxes. And the good thing about our Western societies, Australia and the United States included, is that these kind of crimes are fairly rare and they're becoming rarer, and that's a great thing, and we should celebrate that. And the real instances of it that do occur need to be swiftly and firmly dealt with. It doesn't help that when people are taking advantage of it and making up false ones.
Yes, Nick, racism seems to be on life support in the Western world. It is decried, it is absolutely condemned by the overwhelming majority, and yet it gets so much coverage as if it's a part of everyday life for every minority group. And I wonder if this is why we have these hoaxes, because there's a narrative to feed and you need to feed it somehow.
Yeah, definitely, and it's definitely part of this what we call identity politics trend, and the status we give to victims, right? I mean, if really you shouldn't be giving status to victims. You should be encouraging people to overcome, to draw on whatever inner strength they have to overcome their challenge if they feel they're discriminated against or whatever. But of course, we don't do that now. We say if you're the victim of this, then you're somehow some heroic figure that needs to be protected. So I think there is an incentive to become a victim, and it seems that this is what this poor unfortunate woman was driven to do. I mean, she looks she looks like she's got a lot of issues, put it like that, a lot of challenges. But and I think it's quite right.
Diagnosed with all sorts of things.
The full force of the law obviously should apply, and that's happening. But you can, something is incentivising causing people to do that. And in this case, I think it's the status, the virtue that comes from being an oppressed minority or a victim.
It is. There are people who are desperate to wrap themselves in that warm cloak of victimhood, and I find that bizarre. I just think it would be such a terrible way to live. To feel empowered would surely be what everybody wants to feel.
I completely agree, Rita, because what we want to do is actually encourage people to be resilient and to be strong, and it's not good for them or for society to encourage them to think of themselves as vulnerable and as victims and as weak and as unable to deal with the challenges that inevitably come up in all of our lives.
Absolutely. Now, let's go to a local story that will warm your heart, but there has been a delay in conjoined twins from Bhutan. I'm having a lot of trouble with words today. It's a bit of a problem for me. But we've got conjoined twins from Bhutan who've been brought to Melbourne to have an operation to separate them at Melbourne's Royal Children's Hospital. It was supposed to happen today, but their medical team has called it off. They said they need to be strengthened a little bit more, have a bit more nutrition before they undergo the marathon operation. This is something that I think we should all be really proud of. We have got amazing hospitals, particularly children's hospitals, and these poor kids would have no hope where they were, and they've never had conjoined twins, would have no idea how to separate them. And bringing them here and performing this operation, which hopefully will be successful, it's a lifesaver.
It's one of the miracles of modern medicine, Rita, that we can do things like this. In days gone by, there would have been nothing that we could do to save people like this. But one of the wonderful benefits of prosperity and technology in the Western world, but increasingly elsewhere in the world, is that we can do something and that we can offer hope for them.
There was fundraising done to cover their costs, bring them here. Is this perhaps a program the federal government could institute, where people who are in desperate straits, who need to come to Australia to get this life-saving medical care, could perhaps be brought here? Is there anything like that in place, or is it still left up to people to fundraise to help these kids out?
Well, I think civil society does have a really important role to play, and I want to encourage people to be generous in that way. Philanthropy is a wonderful thing. One of the examples that's similar that I'm aware of in the world, Rita, is Israel has quite a lot of medical diplomacy, effectively, where during the Syrian war and other conflicts on its borders, they've been incredibly generous about bringing people into Israel for life-saving treatment. And I think that is a really good model.
Absolutely, and it's Nick, you and I have actually been to a hospital on the border of Israel with Syria, and we've seen that firsthand. And when they send them back across the border, they don't make sure that their medical records and their medication, nothing says a word about Israel, because that could actually put their life in jeopardy. So the work they do is quite astonishing.
Yeah, I found that instant when we were in that hospital in the Golan Heights, just on the border with Syria, and they were bringing, people injured in the Syrian war were coming across, very suspicious of the Israelis. But the Israelis were giving them fantastic treatment, and they were going home, wanting to sing the praises of Israel. In that part of the world, it's often not safe to do so.
Very quietly, because it's not safe.
Yeah, but with that, and this wonderful story of the co-joined twins, what is it that warms our heart over that? I think from the other side of the world, and people give money to support this, which is fantastic. It's because it's a celebration of humanity. Every life matters, and we don't distinguish. Every human life matters.
And this story was just beautiful. I don't know if you've read the reports the Herald Sun has, but they'd never been outside because their mother was scared they were going to be shunned, because they've never been conjoined twins in that country. And the Herald Sun journalists actually took the mother and the twins out for the first time, and they were embraced. Little old ladies were wanting to hold them, and it was just so joyful to see the video clips of the mum saying that her kids were not being shunned. So I'm getting emotional.
It is an amazing story.
It is beautiful. Look, got so much more to talk about. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back to the Friday Show. I'm Rita Panahi and I'm joined by Senator James Paterson and Nick Cater. We're all together now.
We are.
You're not somewhere else and me talking to you in boxes because it's very unnatural. It puts me off.
Come to Melbourne, you say. Be on my show, you say, and then I get put upstairs in a little box. Anyway, I'm here now. Admitted
We're
to the
all together, so this is going to be one hell of a segment. Let's start off with a Melbourne school which has dumped Batman from its list of house names. Senior students at Box Hill High School launched a campaign to ditch the name along with Deakin, Forest and Mawson in favour of monikers that are more reflective of the current community. Nick, what do you think about this? Because sure, Batman did some things that we don't approve of this day and age. By
So did
no
Robin,
measure.
so did the Joker. But I don't think...
But he's the father of Melbourne and there is historic significance to that name.
I think, I'm just sick of this, really. I mean, we continually wanting to show how virtuous we are as a generation by judging previous generations. I just don't think you can do that. I mean... as you say, Batman was the founder of Melbourne. He was one of the great pioneers, one of the people we have to thank for the fact we have such a prosperous city and a prosperous country. And I think we have to recognise and honour people rather than try to tear them down. I really do. I mean, there are obviously bad people in history. We know who they are. I mean, nobody's going to call name their school after Hitler or Stalin, we hope.
Well, Stalin, I wouldn't be so surprised because it seems to be... there's all sorts of think pieces written about how communism wasn't that bad. There was actually one that was actually saying the Labor camps weren't that bad either, which was
I wouldn't
quite
put it past this Labor state government to go that step too far. But anyway.
Well, the seat of Batman is also going to be renamed. That's a federal seat. What do you feel about that? That's going to be called Cooper.
I'd rather, Rita, that we taught the students in this school who want to change the name of their house about the good and the bad things that Batman did. Because, as Nick said, there are obviously lots of bad people in history, but there are also lots of people who were flawed people who still did important things. And if we go through history having a modern show trial and trying to hold them up to modern standards, then there's not going to have much history left at all.
No.
And really what people need to be taught about is the full richness and the nuance of history, which is that sometimes bad men do good things and sometimes good things are done by flawed people, and we still should recognise the good that they did, even though they've also done potentially very bad things.
And if we keep eradicating and removing these names, then we don't have the opportunity to actually learn because it all becomes we need to have safe, pretty names that can't have any possible negative connotations to them, and it's just a very artificial way of going about things.
Well, it is, and in the end, the sum total of this is we completely misrepresent our history. Because Australia then becomes just a history of bad people doing bad things. It's not that.
Whose names we can't mention.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is that our history is one to be proud of. We've created one of the freest nations, if not the freest nation in the world, a prosperous democracy, and we've done that because people with sound, strong values and good principles created it. Now, of course, there are bad things happen along the way, but you don't judge a country by the exception.
Yes.
And that's the trouble. If we continually highlight the negative things about our history, we forget that there's a lot to be proud of in this country, which is why we're here, why I'm
Absolutely,
here.
and I would love a bit more of that in the schools because there's a lot, even in my day, and gosh, we're going back a long time, it's a good couple of decades, if not more, there was this black armband view that just dominated. And of course, that is important to say about the mistakes that were made, things that we're not proud of, but there's also plenty to be proud of in this country, and that really, I feel, isn't highlighted to the level it should be.
I'm passionate about this, and in fact, the reason that I'm in Melbourne, actually, is because we launched a very important book last night by the former MP David Kemp. It's the first of 5 volumes that looks at, I think, a much truer account of Australian history, because he looks at the fact this was, in fact, a land of dreams, and it became a land of dreams for many people, including many of us who come here later. And it's because it's a country that celebrates and preserves freedom. That's the essence of it.
Absolutely. I'll be getting a copy of that book then. That sounds interesting.
Can.
Fantastic.
Of course.
Now, let's talk about the perfect combination of corporate virtue signalling and celebrity hypocrisy. 2 of my favourite topics coming together, and Richard Branson has done that for us. Thank you. The billionaire Branson has likened climate change to World War III and criticised the Australian government, James, for failing to do more to curb rising greenhouse gas emissions. What do you say to that?
Well, I tend not to take lectures from people who have spent most of their lives profiting from the emission of traditional fuel sources. There's few things that we do as human beings that are more harmful to the planet, if you believe the hype, than flying on aeroplanes. And that is
he now wants to fly as an astronaut to space. He's got some Virgin Galactic Enterprise
I reckon
happening.
that might emit just a few greenhouse gases in the process. I'm not an expert, but I reckon sending a rocket into space...
It's not solar-powered?
Yeah, probably not. Probably certainly not wind-powered. And so, I mean, this is classic, hypocrisy, as you say. And we don't take lectures from people like that, frankly. We just don't.
No. And, Virgin are doing a lot of corporate virtue signalling. They even talked about how they're not going to serve beef on their flights anymore, as if that's going to make a difference.
Sure, I hope they're going to keep plastic straws. They're not going to give up.
Look, no. They've already got rid of plastic straws in their lounges. They came out, I think, a month ago with that announcement.
Well,
so there's a new thing every week.
I would actually buy a ticket from an airline that sells plastic straws. But I think Richard Branson is testing the friendship. I mean, I go back a long way. We don't really, but I mean, when I was brought up, when I was growing up, he produced a great record called Tubular Bells. Do you remember that?
Before my time.
And then one of my early jobs was as a radio engineer, and he got to come in and do an interview, and I shook hands with him, and I was amazed to see him, but he's sort of gone downhill. He goes the way of every, as you say, celebrity. They like to virtue signal.
What I find just as ridiculous is the uncritical coverage he got in the press. No one pointed out, the reports that I read, that this is a guy, like you said, who has profited from massive emissions. Just about every business he's run has had quite a carbon footprint.
Yeah.
And yet he feels like he can lecture Australians who've got sky-high electricity bills and gas bills about not doing enough.
And this is a pretty fundamental point, Rita. I imagine that Richard Branson has never struggled to pay his electricity bill, and I imagine he's never had to wonder in winter, should I turn the heater on? And in summer, should I turn the air conditioning on? Can I afford it? But sadly, the reality is there are Australians who do face those decisions, and my concern is more with them than it is with
He's a terrific
Branson.
entrepreneur. I take my hat off to him the way he's a great publicist. He's got great business ideas and he sees them through. So let's not... I mean, he's more than just a celebrity, and he's always looking for an opportunity for publicity. It's sad that he has to go this route, and particularly sad that he attacks Australia.
He doesn't have to, Nick. That's I think, why we're being fairly critical of him, because he's chosen this route, and I think it's fairly appalling given the businesses he's been involved in. It's just that the hypocrisy is extraordinary. Now, to a story out of Turkey, which I've got to say, first time I heard it, I did not believe it. I thought this is just more Turkish propaganda, but there seems to be a bit of evidence now surrounding the claims that the Saudis lured a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, to their consulate in Turkey and murdered him and chopped him into pieces and disposed of his body. The latest reports suggest the US has intercepts of Saudi officials discussing a plan to lure Jamal back to Saudi Arabia to detain him. And Jamal was a prominent journalist, critic of the Saudi regime. And it's incredible that the Saudis would dare do something like this on foreign soil, James. What do you think? Do you think if there is evidence that this actually occurred, that the international community has to really take a stand against the Saudis?
Well, you're right, Rita. If these allegations are proven to be true, it is deeply troubling, and particularly because the new ruler of Saudi Arabia, known as affectionately by some people as MBS, has styled himself as a reformer and someone who believes in modernity, and has legalised women driving, which is a nice step into the 20th century, has legalised cinemas, also a bold step into the 1950s.
Women can go into sporting stadiums now.
Yeah, all good
it's all
progress.
Very much PR, window dressing stuff,
but that's in the plus column, but there's a pretty significant black mark if journalists are being murdered in foreign embassies. That is very serious indeed.
And it's, even as they were allowing women to drive and loosening some of the requirements, they were jailing the female activists who were advocating for those very changes. And I never believed that he was the great reformer, or he is the great reformer, Nick. And I just think the West has been guilty of looking the other way for too long with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunately, we do have to make enormous compromises when dealing with other nations, particularly in that part of the world, right? Because
I know they're seen as the counterbalance to Iran and Yemen, but
I mean, I think the point to make here is we should never believe that some guy's going to come in and turn Saudi Arabia around. You can't do that because, you know, freedom and democracy has a long tail. It starts, you know, a country's history begins with that story, like Australia.
Do you believe that he's a genuine reformer, that he actually does want to bring Saudi Arabia to the 21st century?
I really don't know. I mean, it's too, I think from this distance, I mean, unless you're a Saudi expert, it's too difficult to tell what his intentions are. But the fact is he won't be able to achieve it because that country does not have the sort of freedoms and democracy that we enjoy. And you can't just change one bit of it. And I think this is a tragic story, and it shows... I mean, why does it resonate with us? Well, I suppose because I've spent most of my career, you know, like you, in journalism. But more than that, you know, it's the if you cannot, you have to. The reason you have to have free press is to oppose tyrants and to stop tyrants. And when tyrants behave like this, then it just chills you.
Oh, but this is how the Saudis behave.
Sadly, yes.
Their prisons are full of political dissidents, bloggers, anybody who's been critical of the regime or even just advocated for greater freedoms. But of course, this has all been blamed on Donald Trump in the US media. I mean, it was some of the reporting.
How does that work?
has been demented. Have a look at the New York Times' Maggie Haberman. She tweeted this. As Trump lands in Pennsylvania, asked if his words about enemy of the people may have contributed to the situation. Trump did not answer. Do they really think that Trump being critical of the US media and calling them the enemy of the people would have contributed to the Saudis killing a critic? Come on. Now, this from the MSNBC host Chris Hayes. He said, would be nice to rule out that the Saudis are paying the president massive bribes in exchange for tacit approval for murdering critics. I mean, can you believe that? He wants to definitively rule out the Saudis are paying. I mean, it is mental. I mean, have these people completely ignorant of Saudi Arabia? Do they blame Barack Obama when Raif Badawi, the blogger, was imprisoned and caned and is still behind bars now? I mean, it is mad. And the Huffington Post has also jumped on this and said Jamal's fate may be tied to the president's habit of attacking the press, now mimicked by autocrats worldwide. James.
It's the longest of long bows, Rita. And
it's absolutely demented. It is. A man has possibly been murdered, and they are trying to somehow connect that to the president calling them fake news.
Yeah, you're right, Rita. And I guess this shows actually the damages that it does to people's brains of toxic partisanship. I mean, they're so obsessed with tarnishing Donald Trump, and no US president is beyond criticism, him included, but to try and link events on the other side of the world and find some tenuous link to him and their personal partisan hatred is a very sick thing. And I think it's very sad that prominent, respected journalists in America are resorting to that.
That's it. And you're talking about people who've been in the game for a long time. They're not ignorant of Saudi Arabia and its ways. They would know this is Saudi Arabia.
I think they probably actually do believe this. This is classic conspiracy theory, right?
I would like to believe they're not that crazy.
There's a great book that came out called Cod, the Fish That Changed the World. It's a very amusing book, and basically the whole of North Atlantic history for about 600 years is all interpreted that the cod, the battle to get cod caused these wars and everything. It's a convincing account until you put it down and think, no, come on, there's other things that...
At the end of it, does it tell you it's all a joke? That would be great. That would be like Dallas, where you find out it was all just a dream.
It is this classic conspiracy. If you once you get into that zone, that they've decided that Trump is just causing every evil thing in the world, it just becomes totally irrational.
But also, we drop our own intellectual guard sometimes when we hear something bad about someone we don't like. We are predispositioned to want to believe it. And, I mean, we've seen this with the academic hoaxes that have been going on. If you appeal to people's political prejudices, then their normal scepticism and intelligence can go completely out the window. And it just shows the importance of taking a step back and trying to be principled and apply principles to things and say, is it really sensible to try and link my US political domestic opponent to a killing of a journalist on the other side of the world.
We see it here,
I don't
right?
think-
I mean, it's the same with our former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. I mean, what Tony Abbott isn't... What evil in Australia isn't Tony Abbott responsible to, according to some commentator somewhere?
Abbott derangement syndrome happening, but I don't think it's anywhere near level of the Trump derangement syndrome, which is taken over the good senses of a lot of these people. And they kind of are living up to the worst things that Trump says about them when he calls them fake news by producing nonsense like this. Now, thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure to have you both. Stay with me. I've got sports and weather after the break.